If the Quran is an ocean and everyone in our society can go and visit the ocean, to their capacity or to their ability, you'll get deep sea divers. You'll get people dipping their toes in, right? You'll even get people just sitting on the sand and observing the beautiful sunset. And maybe that's a perspective that someone who's deep sea diving their whole life will never see, right? So we're using that same sort of concept with the Quran. Yes, we want everyone to be educated about the Quran, and that's why we're having this program to have everybody read it over the course of the year. But in terms of our discussions, when we're talking about what we as individuals pick up on, what resonates with us, we never want to discount what someone from another perspective might pick up on. And in that way, we can discuss, we can disagree, we can agree, we can open each other's minds. We can say, no, I disagree, I don't agree with that at all. But it helps when everybody can hear everybody. So that's why we have this open circle discussion type format, even in our Jummas. And we're trying to bring that into our discussion about the Quran. So we really want everyone to participate, because you never know what you might be bringing to the table that others might not pick up on if you didn't speak up. In the previous verse, chapter 16, verse 64, God tells us that the Quran was revealed to give us clarity on the things individuals and societies disagree about, and to also give guidance and grace to believers. Then in chapter 16, verse 89, God adds that the Quran was also revealed to give glad tidings to believers. So here's the question. This is taken from our curriculum. What clarity have you found regarding the issues that people disagree about? What guidance have you been provided by the Quran? What grace, mercy, comfort, and relief have you received? So essentially, what have you gotten out of the Quran so far?
So I guess maybe just some clarity that the Quran, I think, brings in general is, and what you were saying about misunderstandings, is it talks about basically the beginning of time, and then really Judaism and Christianity, and kind of the difference between the two. And so I feel like one clarity that the Quran brings is kind of discussing both of those and saying, like, this is actually, this is, Jesus is this person, and, this is Moses. And so I think it really clarifies that, and then says in the end, like, but Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the seal and the final. Like, so I think that for a lot of people who are searching and trying to understand religions, like, that's what tends to help guide them.
I got more of a sense that is saying to us, to believers, that you can relax, that I'm not going to give you anything that's going to be confusing. I want to give you assurance even that this is something that is going to be good for you to know, and to rest assured that that God consciousness is going to be the saving grace that's been promoted here in the Revelation as a whole.
This past month, our focus was on becoming a person of both truth and beauty. So there are several chapters talking about how we can avoid corruption, how we can stay true to the Quran and God's word in the Quran. And then we're given many examples of God's beautiful design. So there's a whole section in the curriculum you can explore on that, just talking about the way that everything you see in God's design is both useful and beautiful. We had a couple questions in there, just getting you to reflect on, when you do something, how well are you able to balance between quality and quantity, presence and speed, all of like logic and creativity, whereas in God's design, we can always see it, right? And so then we went into a little bit of a deep dive on the bee. So there's a whole chapter on the bee, and the bee is actually presented to us as kind of a role model of how to live, how to live in humility, how to interact with the world, and then also how to provide healing for humanity, which is the bee's honey. I'm going to read the verses, and as you're listening to them, think about what you hear, what you think, and what you see. So in a previous month, we talked about Quran's metaphorical concept of deaf, dumb, and blind. So these verses actually are calling us to hear, think, and see. So I'm going to read from Quran 1665. And God caused water to descend from heaven, and from it gave life to the earth after its death. Truly in this is a sign for folk who hear. And truly for you and the flocks is a lesson. We satiate you from what is in their bellies, between waste and blood, exclusively milk, that which is delicious to the ones who drink. Then the next verse is, from fruits of the date palm trees and grapevines, you take to yourselves of it what obscures the mind and fairer provisions. Truly in it is a sign for folk who are reasonable. And then the final verse in this section is, and thy Lord revealed to you the bee. Take to thyself houses from the mountains and in the trees and in what they construct. Again, eat of all the fruits and insert thyself submissively into the ways of thy Lord. Drink goes forth from their bellies in hues, ones that are at variance, wherein is healing for humanity. Truly in this, certainly, is a sign for a folk who reflect. We'd love to hear your thoughts on what these verses of the bee as a role model for humanity brings to mind for you.
I was looking at the one you read about the water. God caused water to descend from the heaven. And actually, in your curriculum, you talk about what we perceive as dead is easy for God to bring to life with just a single rainfall. And that verse, a single rainfall, I think stood out to me because it's... sometimes I feel like when I'm in the midst of something and it seems so, like nothing good is happening, it's hard to imagine that like it could just take one thing that could make it turn around. And a lot of times when I'm in a hopeless state, it feels like it's going to take a lot to come out of it. And just thinking that it could just be one rainfall. So I think that makes it easier when you're in that place of hopelessness or despair. That doesn't need to be such a huge shift that needs to happen. Something could come from any direction, just one single time, and that could help. So that was very uplifting to me.
I had some kind of quick thoughts on the bee. Is bee offered as a role model to humans?
You're asking, is it?
Yeah, that's how I read it.
Well, you're saying that the bee is offered as a role model to humans? That's what you got out of it? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And then you'll see in the next verses in a few days after that, it then talks about the spider's web as an example of what not to follow. So it's, as part, for the people who aren't in the program, as part of our Qur'an Literacy Program, we had a mandatory orientation. It's like a 2-hour basically presentation on some of the ways that we're trying to balance out how we approach the Quran. And one of those things that we're trying to do is round out our sort of, I don't want to say human centricity to approaching the Quran, but kind of expanding into the way that God talks to the human in the Quran, where God will make these comparisons between us and other animals, yet sometimes we are too arrogant to see ourselves as animals. We see ourselves as separate from nature and separate from everything else. But God is very clear and all throughout the Quran comparing us to other animals and also showing us that, we have a role and a responsibility above all the other animals because we have free will. So yes, it's definitely something to pick up on that maybe we don't hear all the time when we talk about the Quran. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a question about this verse? Because I don't think I haven't gotten to it yet. Yeah. So if it says, and thy Lord revealed to thee the bee, take to thyself houses from the mountains. Is in this verse, is Allah speaking to the bee, saying, take houses from the mountains and the trees? Or is it talking to people to take houses in the mountains and the trees and in what the bees construct? I'm just wondering about the pronouns there.
Yeah. Does anyone have any thoughts on it, on that question?
Some thoughts on it. The way I see it is, I thought it like it's an analogy, just as in the way like the bee is within the environment, taking into, well, I assume they live in flowers and hives, but I think like when we're talking about mountains and trees, I admittedly have not gotten to this part of the verse yet, but just hearing it how we're talking about it right now, I think that part is supposed to be analogous to us. Like in the way that we should be interacting as a bee interacts with its environment, and also in the interactions that it has, like that shapes everything for the bee, that shapes everything for us. So I think like this kind of verse to me was giving guidance on how we should be conducting ourselves, like as a small being in a much larger environment.
Okay, so we got one vote for it's a parable. We have here Iqbal and Sophia.
So as a role model, B, everything it does creates value, and in a sense, B kind of appreciates the abundance of many different types of flowers to kind of feed itself and all that, and kind of embeds itself in its environment. But also, when you look at the house, it's very efficient, the way they live. So it is a role model for us to be in our communal living, to be efficient with, how we live and in harmony with our surroundings. And also whatever we do creates value for others.
Okay, wonderful. I guess I'll spoiler alert it for you a little bit, Nadia. So I do believe it is talking to the bee, because in later verses, and I think this is going to come up this week, there are verses specifically talking to humans in relation to the mountains, and basically saying, this is an upcoming verse, so I'm kind of butchering it, but basically saying, as humans, when you walk on the earth, don't walk with arrogance, walk humbly. Do you think that you can grow as tall as the mountains or pierce the earth? So in this way, I am spoiling it for you. In this way, it is basically comparing the human interaction with the earth to the bee's interaction with the earth.
Okay, so then what's interesting to me, and I'm reading a different translation here. In your Lord inspired the bees, quote to the bees, make your homes in the mountains, the trees, and in what people construct, and feed from the flower of any fruit you please. That one reminds me, and I don't have the verse on me, but there's a parallel to me in what Allah said to Adam and Eve. The idea of eat from any tree, eat from any fruit, except for this one. So the bee doesn't have the except for this one because it doesn't really have free will like people. So I don't know where to go with that. But the structure of the sentence seems similar to me.
That's amazing. I never thought of that. You're right. We've been given so many instructions of what not to eat, but the bee is not given that because the bee doesn't have free will. That's amazing. See, like even that, you were like, I don't know where to go from that, as if it was nothing. But that was a profound reflection that if you hadn't brought that up, you wouldn't have expanded all the rest of our minds. So thank you, Nadia. We're going to move into talking about Prophet Joseph's story in the Quran. So last month, I know we left on that little bit of a cliffhanger talking about all the richness that is within Prophet Joseph's chapter in the Quran. And I did prepare something in the curriculum talking specifically about the concept of the Zawj. So God's concept in the Quran of the Zawj, of pairs and opposites, specifically talking about the concept of gender in Islam as it relates to humans, everything in nature, and even in terms of the way the Quran is structured. So you'll see in Prophet Joseph's story in the Quran where concepts will come back as opposites, or they'll be presented as pairs, and it's this really beautiful interactive sort of play that this story and all of the lessons and wisdom of his story comes to fruition in the Quran. So I wanted to just first off, open it up and see, because there's so much within that story. Just in general, if people want to share what they got out of that story, anything they picked up on, any reflections that they had, and you can talk about that concept too of pairs and opposites in his story. So anything that you picked up on, coming back later, coming back in a different way. And specifically all of the du'as in that story. So people will pray in a specific way in the beginning of the story, and then they'll pray in a different way in the second half of the story, and it changes. So yeah, just in general.
I just want to put a disclaimer. I'm way behind on my reading.
No disclaimers.
So,
you're good.
But Surah Yusuf happens to be one of my, probably the favorite surahs in the Quran. So I'm going to go ahead and share my reflection. For me personally, I think the way it sets up the story from the beginning on how Prophet Joseph sees this dream and shares with his dad, and he's advised, because his dad has the wisdom that this can spiral out because of human nature. There's jealousy, there's rivalry between brothers, stepbrothers. And the fact that it took years for that dream to materialize and for that training of Prophet Joseph to complete, like to kind of use his gifts, the gift of knowledge, gift of being able to decipher dreams and metaphors. And I think at the end of the story, when Prophet Joseph's dad gathers them all, and he says something to the effect that God has brought us together, like it's through his grace, really, that people can come together, they can forgive, they can move on. And I find the whole story to just be a reflection on human nature and how nature kind of exhibits itself in day-to-day relations and familial relations, in terms of resources, and how, there's wisdom in God's plan and then there's our plans. So, I mean, I can ramble on and on, but that's really like just the beauty of how there's so much layers and wisdom within our everyday practices, whether it's we pray istikhara, right? Like we sleep on big decisions, like we're advised to, pray, sleep on it and pray on it in the night. And then to kind of like look for signs and look for like kind of trusting your intuition and trusting like in some way like God's plan, but then also striving to do the work. So I feel like the whole story is just set up so beautifully. Like as a 9-10-year-old, I remember reading it with translation and mimicking the whole story with my sisters because we wanted to play it, like perform the story.
Wait, who was thrown in the well? You gotta explain that. What do you mean mimicking?
we would just pretend like to be the women that cut their hands because they were enamored by Yusuf's beauty. We would just do like the silliest things and like all the expressions, and yeah, I mean, as a kid, that is my memory of how just people being humans, we have our, quirks, and whoever knows those can really control us, really. So we have to kind of be aware of our quirks and how, we have to be trusting of God's grace to be able to do good. And it's not because of our own gifts. I think it's only because of God and through God. So yeah, thank you.
That's a really important point you just threw in there. That's a famous quote in a lot of religious traditions: know thyself to know thy Lord, right? And if you don't know yourself, and you don't know your Lord, you can get taken advantage of. And so that's a really important point. Thank you. I'm going to go into a couple of the Zawj sort of pairs and opposites. So just to give people an idea of what I'm talking about here. So Prophet Yusuf's story is split perfectly in the middle. So I think it's 111, or I might be getting the math wrong, but in the very half of the story, you'll see that things are going terribly for him, the whole first half of the story. Then in the middle of the story, he finally changes himself in order to change his condition. So this is the whole concept of how we create change in the world, according to the Quran and according to God in the Quran. Is we're told that we have to change what is within ourselves first to then change our outer circumstances. So in the middle of his story, he, for the first time, speaks confidently and positively about himself, and he takes ownership of himself. After years, his whole life being devalued, he claims his own value. And then immediately, the next verse onward throughout to the rest of the end of the chapter, then we see everything starting to pick up for him. And so you can actually divide his chapter in the Quran into the first half and the second half. And so I'm going to go into some of the pairs, and then I'll go into some of the opposites between the first half and the second half. So in the first half of Prophet Yusuf's story, as a child, Joseph has a dream where he sees 11 stars, the sun, and the moon all bowing down to him. Then in the second half of the story, sitting on his throne as the king's treasurer, Joseph's 11 brothers and parents bow down to him. So that's a pair from the first half to the second half. Another pair is in the first half of the story, Joseph's tunic is ripped from behind, and it is only by viewing the tear in his tunic that his adoptive father is able to see the full truth of his innocence. Then the second half of the story, Joseph sends his tunic to his biological father, Jacob, and when it is placed over his face, it restores his full eyesight. In the first half of the story, one of the prisoners tells Joseph about his dream in which bread is being eaten off of his head by incoming birds. In the second half of the story, Joseph is put in charge of safekeeping the kingdom's grains that all the neighboring towns come in to eat from. In the first half, a prisoner tells Joseph about his dream of pressing wine, meaning that he'll serve the king's drink again. And in the second half, Joseph is able to detain his brother, Benjamin, by placing the king's cup in his bag. So those are some, there's so many more. There's some of the similarities or the pairs that we find in the first half and the second half. Just to give you a little bit of contrast, I'm going to go into some of the opposites. So in the first half of the story, his brothers shout down their father saying, "We are well-wishers." So they're trying to manipulate the father, and they say, "We are well-wishers." In the second half of the story, when the brothers are now good, they're striving to be good, they cry out to the father, "We were indeed but sinners." In the first half of the story, the brothers present Joseph's tunic with false blood to prove that he's dead. In the second half of the story, the brothers present Joseph's tunic with his scent to prove that he's alive to the father. It's amazing. It's an amazing story and a really amazing structure, almost structured like DNA, right? The opposites and the pairs intertwining and spiraling to create this beautiful story. So did anyone pick up on anything else in the story or any of these patterns, pairs, and opposites within his story?
One thing that I often think about is the part of the story where he's being tempted by the woman, and I guess on one hand it shows that he's human, right? He's tempted. He wants to participate too. So it's humbling to know, okay, maybe things that we have that are temptations to us, like our prophets had as well. But then also to see his approach to it. So he prays and then he runs. And I remember hearing a lecture about that. It's like he didn't sit and contemplate, he ran, you know, and not that I do that myself in my own life, but just to see that that's the thing you're supposed to do is like you make a prayer and like you recognize and you get out of the situation. So again, just knowing that he had temptations to do certain things and the way that he got out of it.
What I can learn from Surah Yusuf, one of them is a realization that sibling rivalries are real. And then it's very human, apparently, for parents to play favoritism. Whether it's conscious or not, the father favor him over the rest of the siblings. And of course, they're jealous and did what they did. But the good story about the other story that's very touching is the fact that human grief can make them very sick, and we don't realize this. Now, in our community, apparently, this is based on my own experience, we are taught not to express our sorrow in public. Say, even when you lose a child, you're supposed to be, I was informed, like, you should be happy because your baby will meet the Lord. You shouldn't, you shouldn't shed a tear. But Prophet Jacob, the father of Yusuf, showed it that he is in such grief that he lost his sight, and it's okay, it's permissible for us to cry. But this moment of realization that grief is okay, you know, you can express it the way you want it, of course. We don't want to get sick. And I think that's an awakening from what I can learn from Surah Yusuf. And then I'm from Indonesia, what I'm going to share. It's a tradition in my country when we are expecting a baby. We don't know if it's a boy or a girl, so we are advised to recite as many times. If you want to have a good boy with a good character, a handsome looking, recite Surah Yusuf. If you want a good girl, recite Surah Maryam. So with those two surah, it's like recommended. This is just a tradition in my country. So when I was expecting my last baby, I went for an ultrasound. I had my baby late. It's over 35. And of course they said, hey, do you want to do this thing, that thing? I said, no, I don't want to. So then the lady who helped me with the ultrasound said, hey, your baby have no brain. So can you imagine 9 months, I'm thinking like, oh, maybe I'm going to have a defective baby. So I read the Quran more, I read Surah Yusuf more. And everywhere I go, when I went for Jumu'ah prayer, people will say, name your son Yusuf, name your son Yusuf, if it's a boy. And my daughter goes to New Horizon, and she loves this younger student, and his name is Yusuf. So she said, Mom, name him Yusuf. So many people recommend it. So when I have Yusuf, Alhamdulillah, he's healthy. But it gives a profound impact that when you're expecting and you recite the Quran, the baby can be more God conscious, because the dua is from when he was in my womb. That's what I want to share. Thank you.
So many beautiful reflections in that one statement. Yeah, there's so much to what you said. Yes, absolutely. You know, we see sometimes when people are spiritually bypassing others, they're like, oh, you could just pray it away. Like, you don't have to feel anything, only happiness and faith. But that's not real, and it's also not, it's not how the prophets even interacted. So that's an extremely important point that you make. And also the point you made about sibling rivalry and how, you know, we might not even be conscious of, you know, what we're doing to children and the different ways that we treat them, right? And we did address this in the curriculum, both of them in the curriculum, and advise people, like, if you have kids, take the 5 love languages test for the kids, because just because you think that you're treating all of your children equally, it might not be the way that they need to receive the love. So that's really important as well. And I know you said so many things. The last thing I want to touch on is what you said was all of this came from a state of being unconscious, right? So I'm going to read the next question that I was going to get into. So in verse 12, or chapter 12, verse 89, Joseph describes the state that his brothers were in when they hurt him as them being unaware or unconscious. So after the whole story kind of comes to its end, and he's in a position of power now. His brothers are coming to him in need. He could exact revenge at that point, right? But he doesn't, because he says that all of the horrible things that they did to him when they threw him in the well to die came from a state of unconsciousness or unawareness. So the question to you guys, and some of this might be just reflection internally, or some you might want to share. Are there ways that you might have harmed others when you were unaware or unconscious? And are there automated mechanisms, technologies, or other quote unquote advancements today within our society that cause us to harm others as a result of being divorced from human consciousness and awareness? So this is something I'm very passionate about. I put it all throughout the curriculum. Is I really am concerned about the ways that digital media in particular is causing this sort of separation from our consciousness and separation from our connection to each other, even how we communicate. But just as a general concept, do you guys see the connection between God consciousness and treating others well, and having a lack of consciousness and maybe accidentally, unintentionally harming others? Another question in the curriculum was, in the face of these advancements, how can we make sure to not outsource our conscience in ways that may cause us to unknowingly harm other humans, animals, the planet, and even things that we're unaware that we're harming?
I can connect that a little bit to the brothers. So so when you talk about God consciousness, and connecting to what you said about God doesn't change a condition of people until they change what's in themselves. And you have to know yourself to know God. I'm thinking about the opposite pair you shared about the brothers at the beginning, and they said, "Oh, we're well-wishers," and manipulation, and also just no self-reflection on themselves and what their motivations really were. Versus at the end when they said, yeah, we're indeed sinners, they've reflected on themselves and they've shared that, so they have a greater consciousness at the end. And then I was looking at, you mentioned, so, with social media, digital media, all of that, the harm that could happen would be the lack of reflection on your own part. You're showing this just outward life that is a manipulation technique, really, to show only good, and but you're not reflecting on who you really are. So that would be kind of the harm there. And then I was thinking about, you mentioned that the midpoint of the surah was when things changed. So I was looking at the surah.
Verse 55.
55, and it says, Joseph proposed, "Put me in charge of the storehouses of the land, for I am truly reliable and adept." And this is an interesting thing, because you've got the brothers who are reflecting and realizing where they have had shortcomings. And you also have the example of Joseph reflecting and actually sharing an affirmation about himself. And I think that balance is necessary, because a lot of times we're taught, like, be humble, don't say anything positive about yourself, like always, we tend to put ourselves down, and I know that's why you don't do the disclaimers here. But so it's interesting to me, so we have both examples. So to be reflective means to acknowledge where you fell short, but to be reflective also means to affirm what you are, where you're succeeding and doing good things.
Yeah, it's about being truthful, right? Whether it's good or bad. It's a great point. And that's something that a lot of women and just a lot of people struggle with, is that concept of blameworthy modesty, when it's like you're modest to the extreme that you're actually causing harm to yourself and to others.
I'm just hearing the last comment that was made. I kind of have some thoughts about it. It made me think about like how I kind of think that there are like layers to consciousness, like and kind of getting to like a good or like a final layer of consciousness, I think is important. I guess like a really rough example would be like, let's say you had done something that has caused someone in the bad, and then like you're like, I would say like a level 0 consciousness. This is just an example. Would be like you didn't even understand that you hurt the person, and then like the next level would be like you did understand that you hurt the person, but then even after that come a lot of different things, like taking things into context in terms of let's say you had understood how you had deeply hurt someone, and then now with that information, what does that mean to you? And I think a lot of the times in my own life, and I think in how my friends have confided to me as well, sometimes we use that information in a consciousness that is very negative, that might imply something about ourselves, rather than taking into the full scope of like, this might have resulted in an action that might have been harmful. And then now you have that foresight for that, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything about your character, or that doesn't mean you don't have the capacity to learn or grow. So I think that, I don't know, it just made me think a little bit about that in like a religious context. And yeah, just having that kindness and understanding for not only others, but yourself too.
Could you repeat the part you were saying about when it can be negative? I couldn't quite hear that part.
I guess when I was thinking about like a more negative consciousness, or like when it's taken in a negative way, for example, when we were talking about how oftentimes women or individuals in general are like modest, they have a modest take on their like actions and behaviors in terms of like things. Let's say you made an achievement, but oftentimes, we're kind of taught this modesty to be like, oh, it was nothing, but it doesn't really it doesn't really pull you out of like the larger consciousness in general. Like the action does mean something, whether it resulted in something good or bad. There is that value in that. So, in that's just an example. Like in that kind of way of modesty, we're not really seeing something for what it truly is. So yeah, I just think it's interesting that there can be like layers to consciousness, and like it makes me think about frames of mind and how sort of God calls us to have an understanding of ourselves and others and how things come into play.
The intentions are always what matters, and that intention of God consciousness above all. One of the famous verses in the Quran that talks about gratitude is chapter 14, verse 7. And I'll read Muhammad Assad's translation. So he says, or he translates God saying, "And remember the time when your sustainer made this promise known. If you are grateful to me, I shall most certainly give you more and more. But if you are ungrateful, verily my chastisement will be severe indeed." So I'd love to just get people's first thoughts on that verse, and the concept of gratitude and how it is tied into belief in God. So I'm going to read it one more time. "And remember the time when your sustainer made this promise known. If you are grateful to me, I shall most certainly give you more and more. But if you are ungrateful, verily my chastisement will be severe indeed." So what do you guys think the connection is between gratitude and belief, or ingratitude and disbelief?
So I think being grateful, I think, just is a state of God consciousness. And I think just reflecting on Surah Yusuf also, because he was aware and made aware of his gifts, I think he felt he had the agency to affect change, or he didn't have to be humble to the point of that self-effacing. So he was able to use his gifts because I think he was God conscious and in a state of gratefulness. And I think one of the things I reflect upon in my daily life when I'm struggling with things is if I'm not able to utilize my gifts that I know myself that are my superpowers or, things that I'm good at. And if I'm continuously doubting myself or not putting myself forward and being humble to the point of, being ungrateful, I think that's the push and pull where truly to be grateful means to be God conscious. And I think it's a daily thing where we have to be reminded 5 times a day because we as humans are forgetful. And there's outside factors, but there are as many inside factors where we have to kind of challenge our nafs and our ego that, you don't have to play small because you're part of a bigger plan, God's plan. God has given you so much, and if we just focus on metaphors that Joseph was in the well, he was sold and he was, he had all these challenges and he prayed to God to be put away or whatever is best for him, even though on the outside it looked like he was on the losing end or he was guilty or whatever. So I think it's just a reminder that to be ungrateful is to kind of give into our ego, and our ego can lead us in different ways, whether it's, giving into our base selves, whether it's treating other people unjustly or thinking of yourself as superior, which is not humble or being grateful. It's, kind of going overboard with your gifts or with your sense of entitlement or sense of superiority. So I think God consciousness and being grateful is like that equilibrium where it brings us to be in face-to-face with our ego and the higher self. So I think I'm going to ramble on, but yeah, that's what it is.
This is what it's about. Ramble on. Ramble party. Anyone else have thoughts?
So building on that, when I have seen those wheels they have that show feelings, like different feelings. There was one wheel in particular that it was feelings, but feelings when your needs are met and feelings when your needs are not met, and kind of opposite feelings. And in that one, gratitude was on the opposite side of depression. And they were saying, let me get this here real quick. Depression, that if you're feeling, and I'm not talking clinical diagnosis, I'm not talking the full thing, but if you're feeling kind of depressed and hopeless, one thing they say to do is think about what you're grateful for. And it connects, to me, it connects to that idea of the rainfall that we talked about, the metaphor of the rainfall earlier, that even when we're totally hopeless, Allah just needs to send one rainfall and things are coming back to life. And that's the ultimate hope. And God consciousness really is having hope in Allah versus, in that verse, I think when I first read it, it was a little jarring to me because it was like, oh, and if you're not grateful, God's chastisement. And I was like, oh, okay, whoa. But if you think about it, what is the biggest negative that we could have is to lose hope. And that is the opposite of God consciousness, is when we have that feeling of hopelessness.
It can, if we project our own sort of framework onto it, could sound like a threat, but actually Khatiba Maria Kani in our space, she had this great metaphor that we've incorporated, and she said, all of the warnings in the Quran think of them the same way that you view warnings on the freeway, right? Like, there's a curve up ahead, warning, curve up ahead. If you don't heed the warning, you're gonna fly off the freeway, right? It's for your own good. It's coming from a benevolent place to help you stop before you hurt yourself. And another way to view it could be like, the natural consequence of gravity is that when you jump up, you will fall down. So if you're denying that gravity exists, you can try jumping, but don't be surprised when, you fall down and hurt yourself. So thank you for bringing that up, Nadia, because I think that's a big block for a lot of people, when approaching the Quran or religion in general, is that, sometimes there might be someone or an institution or a culture or families who have yelled at people to not touch the hot stove, but that doesn't mean that we should then just go touch the hot stove, or that freedom and liberation is just doing that thing that's going to harm us. It just means checking the person who's yelling and telling them, be kinder. So thank you for bringing that up.
I guess just one other thing, because I forgot the exact verse, but it was something like, if you are grateful, then, do you mind repeating the second part of it?
So this is chapter 14, verse 7. And remember the time when your sustainer made this promise known. If you are grateful to me, I shall most certainly give you more and more. But if you are ungrateful, verily, my chastisement will be severe indeed.
Yeah, so I guess just the more and more, and this is something I'm reflecting on in my own life, is sometimes you think, okay, I don't know, for example, like, oh, I want more money, and you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to be grateful for what I have and expect that God's going to give me more money. But that's just an example, but just the thought that you may not see it in this world, and that's part of our religion, is that you have to accept that if you don't get it here, you're going to get it in the afterlife. And so that's just something, I guess just anything, you think you pray for something and you're going to get it because you prayed for it. And it's realizing that you prayed for it, you're going to get it, but you may not see it in this life. And so just something to reflect that. And then also, I think gratitude itself brings a calming. So even if you are in hardship, which I think we all talked about, just having that gratitude and trust is that calming is what gets you by.
In chapter 6, verse 112, there's actually a town, so this parable of a town that's destroyed because of their ingratitude. So the question in the curriculum was, is ingratitude the root of all evil, first? And how could the entire town in verse 6:112 be destroyed by ingratitude? Based on this story, what do you think the relationship between gratitude and belief is? So we already answered that a little bit, but I want to ask you guys, so if you pick any problem in society, right? If we look at any problem that we see in society today, in each of these scenarios, who would need to be grateful and for what in order for each problem to be solved? So I'll give a quick example. So colonialism, we talk about that a lot, right? So if you're grateful for what you already have, are you looking to other places to conquer, pillage, steal, right? So in that case, it's the colonizer who needs to be grateful, and then maybe they won't be colonizing. So if you think about, I'm sure all of us have, we have such different journeys and lives and things that we're each focused on, and problems that we're each aware of. If anyone would like to share a problem that you've observed in society today, and who would need to be grateful in order to solve that problem? And what would they need to be grateful for?
In the verse it says, if you're grateful, I will increase you, or increase my favors, or maybe make you more God conscious. And I feel like that's just my interpretation, that there is a direct correlation in terms of abundance when you're grateful. So I don't know if that means material abundance. It could be spiritual abundance. but there's definitely an increase in something. And I don't know, maybe it makes people more motivated to do more and get more. So I don't necessarily think it, it can have different reactions for different people. Maybe people who are tired or, they're like, okay, maybe I need more from a place of greed versus from a place of, okay, what can I do with the resources I have and be more resourceful about them. So I'm sitting with that. I feel like the verse itself is saying that I will increase you in whichever way, and I don't know if that verse would have a reducing effect or controlling effect in the sense, maybe a balancing effect.
Yeah, so I think that was my sort of intention was how would gratitude, if you were to apply the concept of gratitude, however you interpret it, right? So if it is spiritual increase, if it is material increase, whatever, how could gratitude, if you look at any problem in our society, how could it be used as a tool of balance and healing, and to solve whatever problems or imbalances exist in the world today?
For sure, I went to environmental problems, and automatically knowing that it's a matter of humanity not being grateful for clean air, clean water, we call it resources of the earth because it's something that humanity is just using without any thought of what happens to the environment. So all of that goes back to some of that corrupted language that you talked about in the curriculum. But humanity needs to be more grateful for God's creation, and I think throughout this section of the reading, it talks about that over and over again in the way that it's that Assad translates it something like that those creations were made subservient to God's law, not just subservient to humanity the way humanity has come to think of it, but is subservient to God's law, and it's meant to be useful, but humanity should be as useful as God's creation, the rest of God's creation.
I saw you nodding your head. I was like, oh, she has something to share, I'm sure. Thank you. Yes, it's definitely a huge area in our world that we need to be grateful for and even conscious of, right? Because how can we be grateful for something that we're not even conscious of, that we don't even realize exists? We'll end with this question, or maybe two more questions. Throughout the Quran, God declares over and over and over again, the future belongs to the God conscious. The future belongs to the God conscious. So when you hear that phrase, what does that make you think of? What do you think that means? That the future belongs to the God conscious.
Sorry, everyone, I'm hogging the mic.
Hey, take it back.
I take it back. I think if we just look at how Quran lays out the stories about the bee, human behavior, spider, I think just becoming knowledgeable is being God conscious. And I think people who get the knowledge and know how to decipher patterns and how to really harvest, whether it's the environment, right? I don't know, genetic, I don't know. Like, we can look at the bad side and then we can also look at the good side. And I feel like people who see that God has given them the agency to explore and in some way, somewhat exploit, they are in many ways being God conscious of their own abilities. So I feel like people who kind of step into their power because they know God has given them that free will and free reign and all this access to harvest and be resourceful, I think those are the people who always keep putting themselves out there and don't apologize for hogging the mic. Yeah.
So you're talking about being grateful for ourselves, right?
Yes, but I think I'm more focusing right now on being God conscious as being stewards of the earth or stewards of the resource. Because if you are aware, right, if you're aware of yourself and what you can do, then you can actually go and do it versus, okay, this is chance, or hey, I just prayed and I'm gonna hope that, you know, more things are gonna come. And being aware that these things manifest in different ways. It can take 20, 30 years for the Prophet to become, you know, what he did. And I mean, it takes time, it takes patience, but I think it's being aware and not lose hope and not like kind of keep going. And I feel like those people who are very strong-willed, and to Nadia's point, you know, being grateful is the state where you don't lose hope. So I think like having that, I don't want to use the example of Elon Musk, but I think just looking at him, how he just keeps going, and there's so many, you know, people and like, you know, critical of his policies and how harvesting all this mineral from Africa is destroying, you know, the labor and, you know, the ecosystem, but he's like, okay, you know what, I'm gonna keep going. And in many ways, it's totally destabilizing, but he is willing to put, you know, himself on the line because he's kind of just going for it. And I feel maybe the sad part is, I think a lot of people who may have a lot of good intentions, I think we doubt of ourselves and we lose hope because we're like, we put our hands up like, okay, the system is rigged and these people are always gonna get what they want because the governments or, you know, every lobbies and the elections and all the Congress is in their pocket. So I feel like instead of losing hope, we have to kind of keep building those little steps because we are all part of the ecosystem. So what does it look like to be environmentally friendly at the same time not harming the environment? Like what does it mean to drive an electric car? Are we really being environmentally friendly? Like I think about that. So I think not losing hope and trying to make sure we're harvesting our networks, connections, resources, and building on it because we might not see it in our lifetimes, but if we are trying to do good and being God conscious and being grateful, we will keep increasing in our steps.
That is perfectly said, and that really is this kind of decolonizing ourselves to decolonize the world. That's the intention behind this Qur'an Literacy Program, is that I'm just looking around, I'm seeing all the good people holding themselves back. And who are the people who are pushing forward? It's the people who we reward with status, power, whatever it is. And I think good people also reward negative behaviors when we're not rooted in God consciousness. When we have a void of morality and moral direction, it gets filled in by everyone who wants to take advantage of that void. So thank you for bringing that really important point up, is that it could actually be just as bad, if not worse, for a good person to hold themselves back in the name of modesty, right? We have to look at the net result of our actions or inaction and then see from there, am I actually doing something good, or am I conveniently using something in religion or culture as an excuse to not to not, be brave and take a risk that might feel uncomfortable, but might have a cumulative effect upon society if more and more people do that. In verse 15:16, so chapter 15, verse 16, God tells us that the constellations were deliberately made beautiful for us to enjoy. How often do you look up at the night sky just to appreciate its beauty? And then the other activity was on the beauty of many hues. So it said, this week, take a look at the sunset every day and see how many different combinations of colors you see. Do you ever see the same color palette twice? And then say subhanAllah, which means glory be to God. So did anyone do that activity and have anything to share? Did you look up at the night sky and remember that God has told us in the Quran that it was made beautiful just for us?
We went camping in the desert, and there's a spot called Milky Way spot, and everyone goes there to see the constellation. And my husband downloaded the app where you can look at the stars, and you can look at the constellation. And I mean, just looking at it is, awe-inspiring. But I wasn't aware of that verse in that sense, that God has made it beautiful just for us. We look at the sky, and I think even when the 4th of July fireworks were happening, and there was a lot of smoke and couldn't see the sky because we were trying to have our own stars on them. We look at the sky a lot of times, and it always kind of, at least for me and my kids, we are always like, oh, how must we look from, if someone was looking at us from their planet or their star. And it makes us kind of feel small, but also like, wow. And my kids are like, oh, we're the only human beings in the universe. I'm like, oh, are you sure? Are you sure there are no aliens or ETs? I didn't think about that verse, but now it just makes me more grateful that just like all the other things that are beautiful, that give us pleasure, like even the sky is a place, if we have nothing, we can look up and just be pleased by God's creation.
I love to read. It's not just the Quran, but everything that my eyes can relate to reading material. So before reading about this, I didn't realize that the color blue and green are actually a color that help us de-stress, and how merciful our Lord is creating so many these beautiful blue and green colors everywhere for free for us to take advantage. We live in a hectic world, but if you take time to go out there and look at the sky, look at the ocean, that will reduce the stress level. Go to the forest and you see the green, not only reduce the stress, but I also read that from some trees is actually, it can emit or cure your cancer. So what they call it, forest bath is popular. You go out there, and you go home, you feel rejuvenated. And Allah created this for us for free. And I always, of course, fascinated. I went on a camping trip a month ago, and that's like a day after when we first see what they call, first time I think in California, what they call it, the Aurora Borealis. So for Californian to witness that was amazing, even though I didn't witness it. The day after I was out there, and my son said, Mom, we want to do stargazing. So it's a tradition in our home when there is like a star movement like that. Okay, wake up at 2 or 3 and we just go to the backyard and lay down and enjoying. But not just that, even when it was full moon or the beginning of the month, it's just so beautiful, subhanallah. And yes, if we only make ourselves alert of the abundant blessings that Allah gave us. There is the word, فَبِأَيِّ آلَاءِ رَبِّكُمَا تُكَذِّبَانِ. We cannot count His abundant blessing.
Blue and green produce, or blue especially, produces alpha waves in the brain. So that was actually one of our activities in the first month, was talking about the alpha waves in the brain and how it's connected to prayer. Sujood in prayer also produces that same brain state. And so the assignment was to look at the ocean and the sky. So yeah, I can't wait for you to sign up. Perfect way to end. So if you guys like what you experienced and got a little taste of what we've been up to, we encourage everybody to join. Next year's program is inshallah going to start in January 2025, so you can sign up on our waiting list. And until then, everybody is welcome to I guess we kicked out all the men today, huh? There's no men today, just in the middle. Sorry, Ross. It is a co-ed program, though, so please feel free to bring the men in your life, friends and family. And we got some men online. We have our power couple, Iqbal and Sophia. They've been coming to every single one, so from Hawaii. So we love seeing you guys. All right, guys, thank you. And congratulations for everyone who has made it this far in the program, who is sticking to the reading. It is a huge challenge. So again, don't feel bad if you're quote unquote behind. You're not behind. You can read every day, you can read every other day, or tell yourself, okay, I'm going to do twice a week or even once a week, but just keep making progress a little bit at a time and make it your goal to finish, because that is how we empower ourselves, and that's how we stop being misguided and misled by false concepts that keep us immobilized when we need to be active and shining our light on the world. So the only way that we know the truth and can decipher the truth from falsehood is if we educate ourselves and read the entire Quran, and we know what's in it, what's not in it, what is Islam, what's not Islam. All right, thank you. Please help yourself to leftovers. We had our local chef, Gourmet as Renee, who catered Halal Soul food for today. And if you guys missed it, we sent an email out talking about the Islamic history of bean pie in America and how it is. I think it's a piece by Slate. They're like, oh, it's the only Islamic or the only Muslim American food. That might be a bit of a stretch, but it is definitely one of the signature American Muslim foods that are a part of our shared Islamic history. So even the way that we talk about Islamic history, let's expand to include all Muslims all over the world and in our country as well. All right, thank you guys. Assalamu alaikum.